Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to this event co-sponsored by the Center for European Studies and the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and also the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies. My name is Geneviève Zubrzicki. I'm director of the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies and the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia. I forgot to say, and I'm supposed to learn how to say that too, that I'm the William H. Sewell Jr. Collegiate Professor of Sociology here at the University of Michigan also. And today I have the pleasure to welcome a dear colleague, Piotr Kosicki, who is Associate Professor of History at the University of Maryland. He's a global and transnational historian of modern Europe. I will tell you a little bit about what he's been writing, but he also lives in Montreal part-time, so which is a special place for me. So it feels like some kind of a homecoming of some sort to have Piotr here today in Ann Arbor. Piotr Kosicki's early work focused on Catholic intellectual partnerships linking France and Poland. That research resulted in several articles and a monograph entitled Catholics on the Barricades, Poland, France, and Revolution, 1891 to 1956. It was published in 2018 by Yale University Press. And after editing a volume about the Second Vatican Council's impact on Eastern Europe, and another volume concerning historical memory of the Katyń massacres, Piotr Kosicki turned to the global history of the political family known as Christian democracy, about which he has co-edited three books. One is Christian Democracy Across the Iron Curtain, published in 2017, followed by Christian Democracy and the Fall of Communism, published 2 years later in 2019, and then Political Exile in the Global 20th Century, 2021. I also want to say that in addition to being a prolific author and curator of important volumes, he runs a very impactful podcast series. What's the title of? It's Through the New Books Network. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to him on that platform, please do. And he's a frequent contributor to public opinion journals, including The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, The Nation, the Times Literary Supplement, and the Washington Post. So he's both a historian and also a commentator on current affairs, but always with deep understanding of history and how history comes into play, but in a way that he can actually explain to people in lay terms the stakes of various contemporary issues. So we're very glad to have him today giving this lecture in our series Conversations on Europe. The title of his lecture is A New Kind of Progressives, How Poles, Venezuelans, and Germans Reimagine Latin America. So please join me in offering a warm welcome to Piotr Kosicki.
Thank you so much, Geneviève, for that incredibly warm welcome and really kind invitation. Thank you, Gosha, for organizing all the logistics, and thanks more generally to the centers that are co-sponsoring the talk today. It's actually my first time in a professional capacity at the University of Michigan. It's a real pleasure to be here, but I also was telling Geneviève at lunch that it's my first in-person invited talk in almost 3 years, so I really feel like I'm coming out of mothballs here. I hope that doesn't in fact show. But this is work that that's been on my mind for almost 20 years in one shape or another, based on some materials that I found before I even started my dissertation research. So this is a book that I'm in the middle of writing right now. There are certain aspects of it that are not at all polished, and certain aspects in which I'm quite confident. But I'm hoping and looking forward to your feedback and thoughts once we get into the material. Now, let me begin by defining a little bit whom we're going to encounter today in my talk. Progressive, a new kind of progressive, the title of my talk, really engages a certain vocabulary, a political vocabulary that was floated throughout the 1950s and 1960s by a transatlantic political family that called itself Christian democracy. I'm going to dig deep and problematize that term in just a moment, because Christian democracy isn't one thing, wasn't one thing, especially in the different geographical sectors that I'm going to be laying out and sharing with you today. But this story also for me is a very biographical story in some sense. And the gentleman whom I've circled in red on the left-hand side of the photograph that you see here. For those in the room not familiar with the Polish language, I'm sorry, I've heard it pronounced lots of different ways in different accents in different languages. Janusz Śleszyński. I think the most uncharitable pronunciation I've heard was Janus by one of his political opponents, right? that Janusz was a Janus-faced political operative. I was not amused when I heard that, I have to say, and this is not something that I would repeat to beyond the context of the joke and bad taste. But I think that the story of Janusz Śleszyński, who frankly is a completely forgotten political figure. He was born in 1917 in Poland. He died in 1985 in Miami. He spent the vast majority of his life on, I would say, intercontinental travel. He really, between the years of 1946 and 1985, did not have one steady abode. He had a house in upstate New York for most of the 1950s and 1960s. There are certain aspects of his biography, even though his 101-year-old widow has been very forthcoming with me in sharing all kinds of details, that I still do not understand. And some of them I'm happy to share. For example, that he told his family that they had to move to Switzerland in the mid-1960s because his life was in danger from the CIA. Some, I think, are a little bit more credible, and they have to do with the way that his political action came together. But the reason that he's on this screen right now is that Janusz Śleszyński became the conduit for passage of a certain vision of progressivism, a post-World War II, post-Stalinist transatlantic vision of progressivism that was supposed to position the family of Christian democracy at the center of politics in Latin America, in his eyes. Now, it may seem strange to talk about a forgotten Polish exile as a motor for powering the rise, or at least an aspiring motor for powering the rise, a self-styled motor of a political family extending across a host of different countries. You'll see I'm going to focus really on Venezuela in this story, and I think particularly it's important to highlight the distinctiveness of Venezuela in Śleszyński's understanding and the Christian Democrats' own understanding. I'm talking about the political thinkers and actors on both sides of the Atlantic, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But if we look at the quotation at the bottom of the slide, the progress of the Christian democratic movement is the progress of the social revolution and the progress of integral democracy. It may seem a rather generic line at first blush, but I want to highlight this line because it appeared on the letterhead of the organization that Janusz Śleszyński ran in New York from 1962 to 1966. It is a line that went out with every bit of correspondence that he and his secretary-treasurer sent out in those 5 years, and really helped to mark in his understanding, and the understanding he sought to broadcast as he connected different political actors from Western Europe, from exile communities from Eastern Europe, from the United States, and across Latin America, what the point of his political action was. He was not a political philosopher. We could, although that's not really the goal of my talk, dissect the ideas here. I could talk about the French philosopher Jacques Maritain as an origin point for this phrase of integral democracy. We could talk about how social revolution really was different and conditioned by his understanding of the need to find an anti-Marxist, anti-communist notion of progressivism. I'm going to touch on these questions as I move through the talk, but I also want to highlight the fact that I understand that progressive, obviously, and if we had specialists on the United States in the audience here, has a very canonical and very intuitive meaning here that I recognize and that I want to acknowledge. Daniel Rogers, in his really influential work, Atlantic Crossings, talked about progressivism in the late 1800s, early 1900s, prior to the First World War, as a kind of move by reformers to capture the state and to use the state to enact social change. And this notion of trying to latch on to and weaponize, in some sense, the state for social change is something at the heart of the story that I'm going to be discussing today, where Ślesiński sought, paradoxically, to push an agenda that would combine revolution with stability. And in that sense, also, Venezuela, I hope you will agree by the end of my talk, makes for a uniquely important fit test case, and actually in some ways, and within a certain time frame, paradoxical success and failure story for what Ślesiński was seeking to do. Just a couple of this, I mean, at this point it's almost maybe unnecessary to go into the justification for thinking about Christian democracy from the European side, but it is worth recalling, because even most scholars of Europe sort of have a kind of maybe a knee-jerk feeling of wanting to push, especially now that Angela Merkel is no longer in power in the Federal Republic of Germany, and also since figures like Viktor Orban occasionally claim the mantle of Christian democracy in Eastern Europe. I'll revisit those two figures at the end of my talk. That nonetheless, Christian democracy after World War II was one of the stabilizing forces on the European continent, and especially its western half. But it was also a presence among the so-called non-fascist forces that survived a very, very brief interregnum at the end of World War II, depending on the country, some leaving or being imprisoned in 1947, some in 1948, 49, 1950, but for whom the onset of Stalinism in Eastern Europe after the Yalta Accords marked a certain need to preserve and export Christian democracy, to relocate it physically, but also to develop it into a global and transnational project. And that's something which I think is often missing from the stories that have been told of Christian democracy as a force, for example, in the conversation about human rights discourse and the emergence of the Universal Charter of Human Rights after World War II. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights after World War II, or the origin story so well worn by now of the European Union. There are few scholars who have tried to make sense of the fact that on the one hand, there are political families using the same phrasing, the same broadly understood name on both sides of the Atlantic, and to seek connections, entanglements, ideas and political practices migrating between them. But very few, surprisingly few, especially on the European side, except to assume that there are certain iterations. Let's say that Christian democracy in Chile, there's a whole vein of historiography in the Italian language, for example, is iterative of certain elements of Italian Christian democracy after World War II. The Belgian Christian Democrats like to emphasize the importance that Belgium had for shaping Christian trade unionism in Venezuela and across Central America in the 1950s and 1960s. So this, again, there are a lot of details here, and I want to sort of make clear that at the same time I'm painting a broad canvas, I have to. Ślesiński was interested in, acted upon, corresponded with 7 different countries worth of political actors, but there were 2 that really became his focus, and there was one in which he really believed. And that also takes me to Venezuela. Now, I should note that the late great anthropologist Fernando Coronil, of course, a major figure at this university for several decades, was in fact, in some sense, remains a key point of reference for thinking about Venezuela as a normative model in social scientific thinking. The curious thing, I want to come back to Coronil's writings at the end here. His book, The Magical State, published in 1997, marks really one of the most profound and honest interrogations of what the state looks like in Venezuela, what political culture developed across a whole longitudinal period throughout the entire second half of the 20th century in Venezuela. But it was published in 1997. Now, for anyone who knows something about Venezuela, that is 2 years short of Hugo Chavez coming to power. It is 2 years short of a major transformation, and itself, I can't say it was a product because he was working on that book for decades, but the publication moment of that book suggests a certain story on its own of, I think, embeddedness in the story that I'm telling you today. And Janusz Szczeciński, who considered, and I think the feeling was mutual, I've discussed this with Caldera's sons, with Venezuelan President Rafael Caldera, I'll come back to him in a minute, on many occasions, Caldera considered Szczeciński also to be a personal friend. That connection also is something that extends, I think, interestingly to Fernando Coronil's work because of certain personal connections between his family and the Caldera family. Christian democracy is really a notable absence from this profoundly important work, whose basic point is that access to the state was a way, and entering into the state was a way of trying to engineer social change, which in some sense actually helps to frame, I think, very effectively the story that I'm telling you today, that Christian democracy, as Szczeciński was trying to channel a certain European understanding of it, as he was negotiating with Latin American interlocutors, was supposed to serve as a stabilizing force, an entry point into a social transformation that never happened. And in his particular rendering, Christian democracy had a unique potential for doing this, not just because of the word Christian. And yes, the religious inspiration was of obvious importance, although he wasn't a theologian, he wasn't a philosopher, he was a lawyer who thought in very practical terms about how to connect and negotiate between different organizations. But this idea of achieving stability is something that I think actually makes his story rather different from much of what we know about the Catholic Church and Catholic actors during the Cold War. And by now, the scholarly conversation about the global Cold War has really blossomed into a sort of an all-encompassing figure where we could easily sort of try to write different political movements in, and Christian democracy would be an easy one. I resist that here. I don't want to talk about this as a Cold War story, even though certain elements of it are clearly made possible by the Cold War, especially the United States involvement and support. I'm not going to go through these individual caveats that I'm drawing from this historiography, but I did want to underscore that there are certain paradoxes that I think become clear in the course of exploring Venezuela's entanglement in a network of Christian Democrats that included lots of Polish exiles and also increasingly Germans, Belgians, Italians, we'll talk about in just a couple of moments. But for the simple fact that there are a few different currents in historiography that really don't speak to one another at all, and that the lack of conversation is something that troubles me, makes, I think, it harder for me to write this book. Partly, in fact, the historian of Belgium, Martin Conway, in a recent book, used the phrase soft imperialism. It's been sort of a knee-jerk assumption that West Europeans had a certain idea, a certain concept of what politics could look like in Latin America in the second half of the 20th century. It comes from, sort of reflected in this description by the French historian Olivier Compagnon that there's a tributary type relationship between Europe and Latin America, that Latin Americans in some sense should just learn from what did and didn't work, whether in Western Europe or Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe had dictatorships, Western Europe had political haggling, both had lessons to teach Latin America. And that is absolutely is part of what Janusz Szczeciński was trying to do, but it doesn't circumscribe it at all. On the other hand, the deeper part of the argument that I'm making is really, in keeping, in some sense, with the spirit of Coronil's argument, that the idea of stabilizing a middle-class serving state in Venezuela was undercut over the long term by this project of putting stability front and center. Christian democracy itself, in seeking reform, in defining itself as an agent of social reform, and I should say particularly bad when it came to perpetuating gender hierarchies, which is something that has been highlighted a lot in the Latin American historiography of the middle classes. You'll see almost exclusively men on my slides. So I apologize for that, but in some sense it's reflective of the assumptions that I'm critiquing and exploring here. This is one of my favorite slides to show. What is Christian democracy? Thomas Aquinas plus Ludwig Erhard with the cigar in his mouth. So seen from the standpoint of the late 1940s, early 1950s, there was indeed a fair question. We're talking about Christian democracy. Are we talking about something more than just a contingent group of people networked, spread over a certain territory, exchanging money and meeting over cocktails in this city or that, and trying to politic the way that any pseudo-liberal set of political parties might politic? And when we think about the economic side, it's very easy to fall into that assumption. I think there's a lot to commend that assumption. And yet Christian democracy fundamentally was supposed to distinguish itself, and indeed in Western Europe, especially in the late 1940s, early 1950s, or in, let's say, Chile or Venezuela in the 1960s and 1970s, did distinguish itself very significantly by saying one thing we can do is we can assume a vision of historical progress, that we are at a cutting edge here. We have the ability to recast an understanding of where we stand in time, to use the state to move us forward, and that we'll do it with the economy, but the state is going to be at the front and center there. And the two politicians, this is two friendships, although Szczeciński's relationship with the future Chilean president Eduardo Frei Montalva soured rather quickly, especially compared to the very, very fruitful relationship he cultivated with Caldera. Both elected presidents of their respective countries in the 1960s after multiple electoral campaigns in the 1950s and 1960s. So the Chilean and the Venezuelan stories, obviously Chile and Venezuela are not adjacent, right? They're very different circumstances. In Venezuela, the story is one of an economy steered by oil rents, by petrodollars, by natural gas. The Chilean story is very different. The Chilean story also is, in some sense, overwritten, while the Venezuelan story is underwritten. When we talk about Chile, we always do it with Augusto Pinochet in mind. When we talk about Venezuela, maybe now we do it with Hugo Chavez in mind, but I actually would argue that Hugo Chavez only makes sense as the endpoint of the story that I'm telling you today, in part. So I'm going to decenter Chile a little bit here, which is something that Janusz Szczeciński and a lot of his political contacts did already in the early 1960s. He brought I'll explain the details of this in just a moment. In late 1959, Szczeciński introduced the then Congressman Caldera and Senator Frei to the president of an organization called the Free Europe Committee, the future umbrella. That's at the time already. You all will probably have heard of Radio Free Europe. Most of you have probably not heard of the Free Europe Committee. Free Europe Committee was also responsible for a lot of covert operations, working in tandem with the CIA until roughly 1971, when really Radio Free Europe supplanted and overt operations replaced the covert. But at that lunch, with the two future presidents, Christian Democratic presidents of Latin America, the president of Free Europe was treated to basically a political vision. What would it look like to have left-leaning, anti-communist presidents in South America. And afterwards, he noted in his personal diary that for his money, Frei Montalva, this is interesting when we consider that a decade later, a little more than a decade later, Eduardo Frei Montalva, by then a former president of Chile, would sign on to the Pinochet dictatorship and say that it was perfectly fine, well, that Salvador Allende's, the coup against Allende had been perpetuated in such bloody terms, that Frei was considered to be too close, too friendly to Marxists by United States political covert heads in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And this is an opinion that Ślesiński shared, because Ślesiński, in the context of the Cuban Revolution, 1959 onward, was fixated on creating an alternative pole. From his standpoint, what it meant to talk about positing a progressive politics for Latin America involved, above all, creating something that would look nothing like Cuba, and in fact would ideally have no contact with anyone involved in the politics with Fidel Castro in Cuba. And for him, some of the outreach that Eduardo Frei, before he was elected president already, was making, even to Cuban Christian Democrats, who were initially, I remember before Castro really consolidated his dictatorship, there were Christian Democrats actually active alongside him in the Cuban Revolution of 1959. So there's a room in that story too for thinking about, for understanding where Frei was coming from. But for that, he was maybe not blacklisted is too strong, but decentered, marginalized in the Christian democratic frame that I am laying out for you today. So we end up with Venezuela, this version of a stability pact. And the reason I use that phrase is it's literally the phrase that guided Venezuelan politics after 1958. It's one of the core points in Fernando Coronil's book, The Magic State, that in fact Venezuela could only seek social revolution, could only seek transformation and empowerment of either the peasant or especially the industrial classes, given the state's reliance on petrodollars, on natural gas, by building up a certain vision of the state guaranteed by its relationship with international partners. And the international partner, oops, did I do something wrong? There we go. You got it? Okay, sorry. The international partner who counted for most became the broadly understood Christian democratic family from outside Latin America, because Venezuela saw itself as the emerging centerpiece of a new Latin American network. So as I mentioned before, this idea of a post coming after World War II, coming after Stalinism, reclaiming progressivism, reinventing progressivism. It wasn't the progressivism of the sort, although there were a lot of common features that we might find with the story Daniel Rogers told in his book Atlantic Crossings, but the progressivism of the 1960s and 70s. I feel like my microphone is in and out. Is it all right? It's okay, all right. The progressivism needed to be cut away from what the East European exiles understood to be a mendacious progressivism, a progressivism which was effectively a kind of maybe apology for Stalinism. Geneviève mentioned in her introduction that I've written a lot about French and Polish interactions in the 1940s and 1950s. This is a lot of what I wrote about in my previous work. The idea that to be progressive was something that had to be put in quotation marks. Well, lifting the quotation marks is something that the Christian Democrats were seeking to do, to create a progressive politics that would be in no way tainted with any kind of compromise with Marxist actors. And that was tricky initially in Venezuela. And this is one reason why Ślesiński looked to Venezuela, because in 1958, we see sort of Caldera piecing through a sense, okay, we have to figure out how to relate to the United States. This is before the Cuban Revolution. We have to figure out how to oppose communists, and yet he needed the support of communists initially to overcome a dictatorship, because there's a January 1958 coup, which is a turning point in Latin American politics. And for Ślesiński, this was the moment that he seized. January 23rd, 1958, the future president of Venezuela, Rafael Caldera, was sleeping in Janusz Szeszyński's guest bedroom in Hastings-on-Hudson, in upstate, well, not upstate, in just northwest of New York City. And he went in, he shook Caldera. This is his wife's version of the story. Caldera jumped out of bed and said, "What?" He said, I've arranged a radio interview for you. The junta dictator has just been deposed. Go give a radio interview and go back to Venezuela. And this was 3 weeks after Caldera's arrival in New York for political exile. He had just come out of prison in late 1957. Szeszyński, in fact, would go to Venezuela twice later that year, in 1958, and Caldera personally requested his presence for the electoral campaign in the fall of 1958, which ended with the conclusion of a stability pact that included all the major parties that were going to participate in the elections, pledging to recognize the results of the elections. Now, there was one party that had participated, the Communist Party, which didn't sign on to the Stability Pact. And that Szeszyński considered to be his own personal victory. Of course, it's easy, hindsight is 20/20. It's easy to say that he did this. And I don't think that that's fair to attribute causality, but he was part of the story. And we know that he was hosting Caldera, and we know that he accompanied Caldera throughout the campaign. Why did this even happen? How did he end up there? Well, Szeszyński and his counterpart, about whom I'm going to say a few words in just a couple of minutes, the German sort of political engineer, if you will, Peter Molt, who would become one of the founders of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. This is Szeszyński and Molt at Szeszyński's summer house in Mallorca in the early 1960s. Nothing like planning the takeover of Latin America in waiters. So Szeszyński really, in the early 1950s, was almost penniless. He had met his wife in Britain during World War II. His wife was French-born. Neither of them returned to their respective countries, although his wife would serve in the UN delegation. As a stateless, passportless person, Szeszyński went where he could, and the first place he could go in the late 1940s was Brazil. So he didn't see his wife for almost 5 years. He learned Portuguese in Brazil. He moved cargo, presumably some cargo that maybe it shouldn't have been documented. But by that same token, he learned and perfected his Spanish and became really the immediate engineer of a project for outreach to Latin America as soon as he was able to arrive legally in the United States, and he did so in 1950, and became one of the founding figures of something called the Christian Democratic Union of Central Europe. And this organization could not have existed if not for CIA money, if not for the Free Europe Committee. This is it wasn't just Poles. It was an agglomeration of all the so-called captive nations from across Eastern Europe. And there were certain nations that couldn't be included, Slovenes, for example, because the US was friendly with Tito. But on the other hand, the Baltics, for example, were included. Point being that Szeszyński ran the agenda because he was the only person who knew Spanish and Portuguese. And even though he was in his early 30s, and actually his English was far inferior to his Spanish, Portuguese, and French, he quickly figured out how to become the sort of nexus of an emerging network. And the sign you see here, the Center of Christian Democratic Action, is an organization that over the course of a decade, he would justify, he would explain. In 1955, he would write later, no one in Europe cared about Latin America. So what did he do? He went to the representatives of the CIA at the Free Europe Committee and said, let's start a Spanish language bulletin that I can send out en masse to aspiring Catholic politicians all across Latin America. I have thousands of letters that he received from Argentina, Peru, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, far afield. So it's a very broad understanding of the sort of Latin American diaspora here. But the point being that Szeszyński's bulletin, the Información Democrática Cristiana, was actually read. It actually generated responses, especially from people in their 20s and 30s. There were a lot of student union leaders who were thinking, aha, this is what's going on in other places in South America or in other places in Central America. And this idea of constructing a sphere, a transnational Christian democratic public sphere that had the potential to establish an agenda for progress, that's actually something that he was doing as his first activity. It was only minimally funded except for really the mailing costs. So the postage is what the CIA was paying for Ślesiński. Everything else he was able to do as a kind of a two-man operation at that point. But you see the feedback, for example, he gets in 1956 from Argentina, the degree of information, but also linked to this idea of an anti-Soviet struggle. There's always an anti-communist imprimatur to the messaging. The idea being, let's connect Latin Americans, but let's do it in a way that establishes a baseline for talking around and avoiding or pushing back openly. Maybe not even necessarily fighting, but showing that the Soviet model is an ineffective model. And that was even before the Budapest invasion in the fall of 1956, although that obviously makes it easier for him to make that case. So by the time that he goes to Venezuela in 1958, sorry, a couple of slides just sort of giving you the backstory, he feels like he's actually making some progress with this idea of establishing a common frame of reference and a basis for knowledge across different Latin American constituencies in different Latin American countries. And I don't want to paint with one brush here because obviously the political situations were incredibly different in these different countries. But if you just look at his own personal archives that were aggregated, it seems that really there was a similar set of responses. Again, some talking about what was going on with Perón, some talking about what was going on with the emerging junta that would be deposed in 1958 of Marcos Pérez Jiménez in Venezuela. I could go on with the different examples, but the point being that from Ślesiński's standpoint, he could imagine reaching such a thing and helping to construct such a thing as Latin American Christian democracy by means of a kind of a pretty inexpensively produced information bulletin. Why was Venezuela so important for him? Okay, so he met Caldera for the first time in 1955 at a conference in Chile. He got to know Caldera a little bit better in correspondence, but really it was that visit in New York where sort of the phrase, but the accident of history, if you will, that Caldera happened to be with him at this moment of historic import, and Ślesiński could turn and say, I'm going to try to get some money to come and advise you in your campaign. Let's try to make this happen. Caldera had a long career in politics at that point. He had been imprisoned. He had been in politics since he was in his late 20s. He had been a student movement leader. He wasn't new to politics. What was new for him was this idea of opening to the US and of taking the US very seriously as a potential, even, maybe let's not say neither covert nor overt partner. The picture on the upper left is what you see, the Stability Pact, the Punto Fijo Pact of October 1958, the different major political leaders in Venezuela agreeing to work alongside each other, basically more or less to pass political power back and forth and respect the results of subsequent elections. And Ślesiński believed that this, and this was again just before the Cuban Revolution, that this was a key moment to avoid a story, and also a moment where he had new ammunition, because he could say, look what the Soviets did in Hungary. Look what's going on across Eastern Europe. And the US-based political operatives could say to themselves, yes, the quotation here is from the handler, maybe not the best term, but I think it's accurate, for Ślesiński's activities in 1955, 56 to 58, saying we can add trained East European exiles to the Western order of battle in the uncommitted areas. What are the uncommitted areas? Latin America, for example. Now, this, of course, does imply a certain, maybe not even so soft, imperialism, right? There's a whole conversation I'm not getting into about Monroe Doctrine, US at best paternalism, but clearly long-standing neocolonialism toward Latin America. In some sense, Ślesiński understood that, and was willing to look past it because he really needed the money to support his organization. But he also recognized that Christian democracy was just something that most people in the US wouldn't understand. So he had a pretty wide maneuvering room for that reason. There's a wonderful internal memorandum from the Free Europe Committee archives, which I love. It's the Free Europe brass trying to explain Christian democracy to each other. And this is the best they could do. Progressive, but non-Marxist. Right? That's taking them at their own terms. Somewhere between ultra-New Dealism and constitutional liberalism. Ultra-New Dealism, whatever that means, right? I mean, of course, the religious content, the confessional content doesn't play a role in this definition here, but this is something that Szczeciński could run with. A recognition that as long as the political family was anti-Marxist, he had maneuvering room, and he could move on with that. Now, there's a wrinkle which makes it hard to sort of transition smoothly from the Szczeciński heavy part of the story to the part where he really brings in partners from Western Europe. And that wrinkle is JFK. JFK for Szczeciński, and I'm quite convinced that Szczeciński believed this. Certainly the partners in his projects with whom he worked, with whom I've spoken, with whom I've done interviews, and the correspondence I've read suggest he believed that John F. Kennedy was an aspiring Christian Democrat. Now, John F. Kennedy didn't see himself that way. There were certain people close to John F. Kennedy, probably most notably Eugene McCarthy in the US in the 1960s, who had sympathies for Christian Democrats. Another, you'll see in a picture in just a moment, the future Vice President Hubert Humphrey. And Humphrey actually is someone that Szczeciński got to know pretty well and tried very hard to bring openly into a global arrangement of Christian Democrats, although the Democrat resisted that. But the project that Kennedy represented for Szczeciński, especially when Szczeciński heard the phrase Alliance for Progress the first time. Of course, there's a substantial literature, scholarly literature about the Alliance for Progress, about what a devastating failure it was in so many ways. A wonderful new book by Margarita Fajardo about how especially Latin American economists initially tried to support it and then ended up completely backing away from it after it was discredited. But the assassination of Kennedy in November 1963 in some sense spelled the beginning of the end for Szczeciński's ability to intervene. Certainly he could look forward to substantial funding cuts, but more generally he didn't have a project that would have the same contours. This idea of a hemispheric Christian democracy that he had been pushing, which actually would allow him to link up and reinvent in some sense in a way that he could discuss with Caldera, the relationship between Catholic politicians, for example, in Venezuela, and Catholic politicians in Washington, D.C., was something that was no longer possible. He didn't give up completely. Like I said, he would try again and again with Hubert Humphrey and Humphrey's advisors. But one thing he did was recognize that there were partners in Western Europe. And now some of those partners worked quite closely with other East European Christian democratic exiles. I don't have time to go into all of their stories, but Szczeciński was extremely well informed, for example, before the Konrad Adenauer Foundation was formally launched in the early 1960s about the activities of its predecessor, something that was called the Institute for International Solidarity, a unit within West Germany's Christian Democratic Union. And the Institute for International Solidarity hosted Caldera in 1962 in Bonn and left him with this impression that he described for himself, that at least in Venezuela, the forces that serve Soviet imperialism are preparing in an immediate attack. And it's something that he became more convinced of after visiting Germany, and the need, probably because, at least in part, he saw this as a way of beginning a fiduciary and financial relationship with West Germans, began to take up a lot of the mantle of the projects that Szczeciński had been pushing early on with American support. One thing that's, this is well known to certain scholars of German foreign policy or international development discourse, but the Konrad Adenauer Foundation by 1980 was delivering 40% of its operating budget to Latin America. Now, obviously, I don't want to, again, paint with one brush. And we're talking about different countries, different constellations. For example, the Adenauer Foundation was supporting both Christian Democratic supporters and opponents of the Pinochet regime in Chile. There are all kinds of things going on. Historians are just starting to scratch at the surface. And a lot of this is still subject to certain privacy restrictions in the archives of the Christian Democratic Union in Germany. But this idea of soft imperialism, to return to that phrase from Martin Conway that I used early on in the talk, I think is particularly useful when we start talking about formal political parties. Szczeciński nominally was part of the Polish Christian Democratic Party, known as Stronnictwo Pracy, the Labor Party, but really he identified as an international man of Christian democracy. That's not the case for, let me just go back here for a second, for Peter Molt, right, his frequent vacation partner from Mallorca. Peter Molt was one of the top advisors of Konrad Adenauer in the early 1960s, and he became one of Adenauer's most trusted foreign policy brains trust members, let's say. So, for example, Molt, who was responsible, among others, for incorporating foreign guests into the political academies for young generations, training young cadres of Christian Democrats in West Germany, had a very specific vision. Let's throw a lot of money at Latin America, and let's make it clear also that this is not US money. Because European influence, I mean, you can see in the quotation here, has a better chance of being accepted than that of the US. And then the quote continues, whereas the European position, on the other hand, is often extremely difficult in Africa. So the Institute for International Solidarity in West Germany had a lot of different ideas, and so only some of them would come to fruition. But one thing that the historical contingency allowed Molt and Szczeciński to work on together was Venezuela in the mid-1960s, and specifically the creation of a political academy, modeled in some sense, and this was, I think, Molt's influence more than anyone else's, on the Eichholz Political Academy of the young Christian Democrats of West Germany, but in Caracas, the IFEDEC, Instituto de Formación y Educación Demócrata Cristiano. Now, what the assessment of maybe the top sort of scholar writing so far about Latin American Catholic political thought is that almost the entire Christian democratic political elite of the continent passed through the IFEDEC's halls between its founding in 1962 and the late 1970s. And the fact of the matter is that this was a real collaboration between different Christian Democrats in different countries. Szczeciński was able to get the United States, one of the last big commitment he got, because it was still while Kennedy was alive, to commit to 60% of the initial operating budget. 30% of the initial operating budget came from West Germany. 10% came from Venezuela. But the goal was to rotate German and Italian and Polish and Hungarian and Belgian Christian Democratic lectures through the halls to give a global view. The soft imperialism question is one with which I'm still wrestling, because it's difficult for me to determine the balance and really assess who was in the driver's seat in terms of the ideological content. It's clear that everybody had their own agenda, all of the different players in the story, and they were many. You see a Polish exile, a Belgian labor leader, the main advisor to future Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro, one of the key figures in Dutch and German Christian democracy, Karl Josef Hahn, and they all together ran a sort of informal organization called the International Solidarity Fund, which basically existed in order to fund Christian democracy in Latin America and, parentheses, someday maybe Africa as well. The latter part never happened, although that's where the document from before was pointing. This is just the letter that I have where Szczeciński and Caldera are talking at great length about how IFEDEC should look. And the assessment also that the Germans provided, because the Germans really wanted the folks like Hubert Humphrey and his advisors to enter more openly, even after the Kennedy assassination, into cooperation to support anti-communist Catholic politics in Latin America, is to make the case that Christian democracy reduces anti-Americanism. that actually the United States comes off better, for example, in Venezuela, ever since the push to elevate Christian democracy. Now, that I think also is maybe a question that's a little bit up for debate. In the end, we have nice photo ops with Szczeciński and Hubert Humphrey and Rafael Caldera, but Humphrey never made that kind of commitment. He was too busy with Vietnam. And in the end, his top foreign policy advisor said, no way, we'd just hurt your cause if we get openly involved in what's going on. And at that point also, Szczeciński's own covert funding was being cut. Not least, because of particular contingent circumstance, like the US invasion of the Dominican Republic in the context of the Dominican Civil War in 1965, which came right in the middle of this most sort of exciting, in a sense, but really engaged period of US, West European, East European exiles cooperating and trying to get Christian democratic enterprises off the ground financially and contribute ideologically in Venezuela. Now, Caldera, by this point, really entirely on his own, in the sense that he had completely sort of reinvented himself by 1968. Szczeciński didn't have the money anymore to participate. The Germans also were starting to look elsewhere. By the 1970s, they would be focused principally on Chile, and it would really backfire on them in ways that I can't get into now, but you can guess a little bit at it. Caldera as president, we can discuss the extent to which he fits this notion of stabilizing the state in order to make real social reform happen. He raised taxation on oil rents by 60%. He nationalized the natural gas industry in Venezuela. The specialists in Venezuela will talk about his pacification of guerrilla movements in the countryside. So there was a qualitative shift. And by the way, Caldera was elected by a razor-thin margin in 1968. But he was elected nonetheless, and his legitimacy was recognized. So does he fit into the story of, in some sense, undercutting the future potential of middle classes governing and existing for and by, if you will, a stable state that is nonetheless progressive in terms of its overall political outlook? I think that is both true and false. And in some sense, and here I'm really skipping a few pages already because I have to get to this moment in my own thinking, and I'm not quite there yet, in order to try to explain how Caldera, I mean, we can talk more about Venezuelan politics if you want during the Q&A, but really I wanted to shape a little bit by way of conclusion where I'm going with this notion of progressivism and Christian democracy, and ultimately also what the balance of different influences was there. Because I think it matters that it was an eclectic assortment of influences. Western Europeans, East Europeans, a little bit of the US, but not too much, for all the reasons that we discussed already. And most importantly, the Venezuelans themselves, developing and trying to understand what they wanted. The COPEI, the Venezuelan Christian Democratic Party on its own, trying to define IFEDEC on its own. I mean, the answer, of course, is there wasn't one version. There were many versions. I talked mostly about Caldera because he was most open to leading international cooperation. He was quite a prominent face. And Caldera is also a fascinating test case, another one of those accidents of history, because he would be the president who would hand off power in 1999 to Hugo Chavez. In other words, he had a second presidency about 25 years after his first presidency, and he actually broke with his own Christian Democratic Party in order to run for and win the presidency in 1994, because the Christian Democrats were perpetuating the Stability Pact, which by then had actually ruined largely the Venezuelan middle classes. So if we take Caldera as the test case, then Caldera comes out looking pretty good. And I think that's probably one reason why Coronel didn't discuss him so much in the book, because the political formation became less about progress and more about stability. And I think that the distinction there is something that we can really tease out as we trace the story. Now, in my book, I'm really focusing a lot, which I didn't quite do in this talk, on the impact, the regional impact of the Pinochet coup in 1973, because I think that has a lot to say about where the different international actors would land, and also what it meant to be a Catholic politician in Latin America, when for some that meant saying, well, Allende was going to bring communism. He got what he deserved. And for others, that meant saying, how could you possibly take that stance? There's a social justice agenda at stake here, and progressives aren't murderers. So without getting into that conversation at great depth, I think we can see that Christian democracy, I mean, to maybe put two different points on it. As a global family, it's not really coherent. And yet, this idea of trying to access the state as a means for steering economic resources fits both in Western Europe and in Latin America in a way that I think is very productive and does take us back to that picture of Ludwig Erhard smoking his cigar, because it actually works with the kind of vision that Christian democracy became part of in Venezuela in the 1960s and 70s. Now, was this Janusz Szeszelyński's vision? Janusz Szeszelyński represented, in some sense, East European Christian democratic exiles, was seeking a vision of what it meant to be a Catholic progressive engaged globally, not locally, not nationally, globally, in the aftermath of Stalinism, in the aftermath of de-Stalinization. And from his standpoint, that meant more cooperation. That meant people talking to each other across national borders. And that is something that IFADEC facilitated very, very well for Caracas, but it's something that also became much, much more challenging after the Pinochet coup on a continental or regional level. And in some sense, if we look to the last few years, Christian democracy, of course, ceded power a few years ago with the retirement of Angela Merkel and the Federal Republic of Germany. As I mentioned, Orban is not himself, doesn't call himself a Christian Democrat, but considers Christian Democrats to be his closest political partners, calls himself a Christian nationalist. But the notion of trying to understand the trajectory of Christian democracy and the trajectory of the kind of vision of being a progressive, that especially as we sort of look on past this collapse of the Soviet Union and into the 21st century, does allow us certain, I think, payoffs for putting together the stories of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. My own personal hang-up often comes to where the US fits in. I can't write the story without it, but by the same story, the US automatically, for very good historical reasons, often overwhelms stories that have a lot to say about Latin America. So, anyone has any feedback on that, I'd be very grateful. But thanks for your attention.
Thank you for this interesting lecture. It was not presentation, but it was very, very interesting lecture about Christian democracy. And I think that political scientists should frequently attend this kind of lectures. Oh. I'm by training political scientist. So my question is rather the question of understanding. So when I'm looking at this slide, I see the different phases of Christian democracy, if I'm correct, like Angela Merkel, Orban, and they're from the Latin America. I'm wondering what the reason of these varieties of Christian democracies. So what are the mechanisms that differently shape? It depends on the history, it depends on the political context, yes, or there are something else beyond it. So this was my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So, there is a very good political science literature on Christian democracy, which often considers Christian democracy. There's literature that's better than the literature I like is a literature that looks at it separately from the institutional strictures of the Catholic Church. Because I think that it's often very tricky, especially if I look to the German case. The Christian Democrats in West Germany in the 1960s collaborated most closely, not with the Catholic hierarchy, but with social democrats. in order to support Latin American Christian Democrats. So there's going to be a lot of variety, I think, and a lot of different flavors to the answer. Of course, it's a catch-all term, right? So this, I think the danger with catch-all terms, and especially after a lot of Christian Democrats stopped calling themselves that in the 1960s, is that there are these kind of normative groupings which we can argue about, and the taxonomy kind of becomes death by 1,000 paper cuts. I do think that there is an underlying core that is worth considering in particular here, and I alluded to it, but my talk wasn't about it fundamentally, because I think that it would be possible to tell a unifying history of the different Christian democracies, and the glue is actually French Catholic thought in some ways. At least acknowledging it, maybe not even necessarily being that familiar with it, but in Latin America, arguably, personally, Jacques Maritain, there's a wonderful monograph in French, and I say wonderful, there are things about it that I really disagree with, but the research is phenomenal. That was written 20 years ago by the historian Olivier Compagnon, who made the case that really, you look to Latin America, Jacques Maritain, there were moments in the 1970s where he was on the lips of chanting crowds in a way that Western Europe never, no way. And we could discuss then what it means to have a mass phenomenon, a mass party that's Christian democratic, right? Are we talking about the technocratic elites? Are we talking about, interlocking groupings? A lot of the early histories, political histories of Christian democracy in Europe were really about meetings of a few dozen people in Switzerland or in Belgium or whatever in the years immediately following World War II. East European Christian democratic history, that is a story of a few dozen people, fundamentally, largely because the parties went into stasis after they went into exile. So, the question there is, by what right do they still call themselves that? Well, sometimes because they had the money, sometimes because they had certain registered holdings. But fundamentally, if we trace the genealogy, I think there is a common core, at least of paying lip service to an ideological reference point. That being said, there are other features which we can broadly group. Things like kind of a desire to soften the market economy, things like restructuring of the relationship between trade unions and employer interest groups. I could go on and on, but hopefully that is beginning at an answer to your question.
Maybe I'll ask you more about the American nexus, because you seem to be downplaying the role that America is playing, but yet, the whole operation is based in America, and you mentioned that they're emulating, or at least seeking to emulate JFK, the whatever we call it, the Ultra New Deal, emulate or ideal. Sure. The Ultra New Deal ideal, I guess. Humphrey and their attempts to engage him. So it does seem to all revolve around the United States, yet you don't see it as an American project. So
okay, so I love the way you phrased it in the sense that I think I've been successful if it feels like I'm downplaying the US. Because I've always in the past when I've spoken about this story felt like I was making it sound like a global Cold War story, which was basically driven by US money and interests for a time. So to my mind, let's think about the US as a kind of empty is not quite right, but a container of a certain shape into which one can then fill with certain types of political ideas and political behaviors. And that container, went bad after a certain number of years. I'm sorry, I'm sort of making up the metaphor on the fly, but between the mid-19, let's say 1950 to 1965, 66, you're right. There was real room, physically, infrastructurally, financially, in some form. The term that's usually used by scholars of free Europe is state-private network, of state-private networking that would facilitate transfers to support all kinds of different exile ventures. And the historiography was almost zero on this until about a decade ago, except for little off memoirs that wouldn't circulate, or things written by scholars no one had ever heard of that never made it into an EBSCO or JSTOR. Now there are a few really good books out in a few different languages, and more that are going to be out in English, which I think will speak to the variety. And the reason why I'm glad that it seems like I'm downplaying the US interest is because of a few different things. Ultra New Dealism, I could make a plausible case for it. I mean, I have the Catholic intellectual history of the 30s. We could talk about John Ryan and the Jesuits who occasionally surrounded Franklin Roosevelt. That's not what the Free Europe Brass were thinking about. They didn't have that sense. They were trying to find an analogy in order to justify the expenditure. I think it was a memo from a vice president to a president saying, here's what we're trying to do in case the director of the CIA asks you, for example, who these people are. Which that in and of itself is interesting, but I don't think determinative of any element of the story I'm telling. The Humphrey part, I think, is really important because there were repeated attempts from both sides of the Atlantic, from the East European exiles, overtly and covertly, from the West Europeans who were spawning their own different projects that would in some sense outlast Ślesiński's for sure, but really even the Free Europe CIA nexus. Humphrey really didn't want to profile himself as a Christian Democrat. He never addressed exactly why, because he did appear at conferences and he sent his advisors, notably John Riley, whose papers contain a lot of these materials, who was actually spent a lot of time in Chile representing the Democrats in the 1960s. But the Humphrey story seems to me like he really wanted to show solidarity with certain political formations without boxing himself into a corner as too confessionally oriented in the U.S. He just thought it was going to hurt it. I mean, he was a U.S. politician, right? He was thinking about his electability. So the overall answer I guess I'm giving to your question is that I think for each element you cited, there's a really interesting story, but I don't see them coming together into a whole, except in a way that feels to me almost too easy to say that, the US was behind it, right? I mean, that's, how many times have we heard that? And in some sense, sure. Although the US was not behind what the Germans were doing. But I would argue that the Germans couldn't have done it without groundwork that the Poles especially Ślesiński, but he had colleagues working with him as well, had laid a few years earlier. They needed someone to pay for it, and the U.S. was willing to oblige for contingent reasons. But you're right. At the end of the day, thinking also about how to pitch the book to presses, I've been really struggling with that question because there's such a heavy set of assumptions that go into the US and the world conversation, and especially the US foreign policy during the Cold War conversation. Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
Is it? Okay. So I'm going to bring it back to Poland.
Yay.
And actually back in time because
Sure.
I'm curious about Ślesiński.
Yes.
What's his background before World War II?
Right.
Where is he educated? And
Okay.
what you mentioned that he's involved with Stronnictwo Pracy, so this
Yes.
kind of labor party.
Yes.
So that's one question.
Great.
And
Thanks.
if you can, in your answer, kind of make a genealogy of Christian democracy in Poland.
Yes.
Because when you say that Orban,
Yeah.
you put him next to Angela Merkel,
Yeah.
I'm kind of,
Yeah.
is law and justice for you, is that Christian democracy?
I worry it might be. But and if you ask me, I'm sorry, we'll get to that in a
Okay.
second.
Because I mean, Christian nationalism is not necessarily
Yes.
an outgrowth of Christian democracy,
Right.
or is it? So
Okay. No, this is.
basically, maybe that the question about the
I published a whole
origins
article about
of-
this, but I'll try to condense it into 3 sentences in a minute.
Well,
I want to talk about Szczeciński first, though,
I
if
think
that's
that
okay.
the story you can
Yeah.
link, you
Yeah.
can get Szczeciński to these issues. Now.
Oh, absolutely. No, thank you for that. And you know, in some sense, that's the story, that's the question I wanted with this slide. And that is the slide I did at the last minute. I was thinking, ha. Because Orban, of course, you know, okay, I'll come back to him in just a moment. Szczeciński was born, as I mentioned, at the tail end of World War I.
Where?
He was born in Warsaw. So he actually grew up the son of one of the founders of the Chrześcijańska Demokracja Party from the interwar period. And that his father wasn't very politically active, but he was very close friends with the person who would become Szczeciński's boss in the Christian Democratic Union for Central Europe in the 1950s, and that was Konrad Sieniewicz, who was in control. He was basically the secretary-treasurer of the Polish Christian Democratic Party, the Stronnictwo Pracy, at the time that the party went into exile in 1946-47. The interwar is it's both a very different story and it isn't. And the interwar, in some sense, is what has to condition my answer to your question about Orban and Christian nationalism, because one of the defining features of Christian democracy in the interwar period was anti-Semitism and exclusionary nationalism, more broadly, but especially anti-Semitism. You read the Christian Democratic Program from 1938, one of the planks is send the Jews to Madagascar. This is Korfanty, who was the predecessor of Karol Popiel, who was also in some sense a boss of Szczeciński for a time. Those weren't Popiel's views in a strict sense. He never articulated them after the war, but he was part of that organization. He was one of the leaders of that organization. And Korfanty in particular, I mean, those in the room who don't know what I'm talking about, he was really a fascinating figure, one of the leader of the Silesian uprisings that helped to determine the shape of the Polish-German border as the state was being reformed out of the end of World War I. But Korfanty had a previous political life where he had basically been a national democrat in the Reichstag in the early 1900s in the German Empire. So there was a long-standing nationalism there. And in this sense, Poland is not unique. Each of the countries, I mean, I can talk about Hungary a little bit more because I put Orban on the screen, but Hungary had its own, I think we can sort of maybe say that sometimes this was more or less overt depending on the percentage of the party leadership that was wearing a cloak and, not a cloak, that were men of the cloth. Because I think that would also be determinative. But for example, in Poland, only a few were. Most of the leaders were lay figures, like Korfanty or Popiel. So it's not a strict correlation. For me, interwar Christian democracy in East Central and Eastern Europe is wholeheartedly endorsing and needs to be described as such, Polska dla Polaków, or Eastern, in a broader regional sense, national purity and ideologies of ethnic cleansing. That was never a project afterwards. In fact, the Christian Democrats after World War II, especially in exile, became known as outspoken advocates and monitors of human rights violations. That was actually, Szczeciński, the last decade of his life, was working as a consultant for the UN doing human rights violations monitoring. And his wife worked for the UN her entire career, basically. So, I mean, in some sense, Christian democracy dramatically reprofiled itself out of the ashes of the Second World War. But this is another one of the moments, your question about what makes Christian democracy, each national story is different too, because the Poles were actually in resistance. So they had a different story to tell in a way that was not quite the same, for example, for the Hungarians, some of whom were in resistance, many of whom were not. right? And we could keep going with the different nationalities. It was worst of all for Czechoslovak, parentheses, Slovak. We hide the Tiso collaboration story, right? Where you actually have a priest leading the puppet collaborationist state. But I think that it's really, really important to look back to the interwar. And indeed, every time, maybe not so much in the past year or two, but when we were hearing these analogies, let's look back to the 1930s. From serious scholars of right-wing populism in 21st century Eastern Europe. For me, that includes things that I've studied as an intellectual historian of political thought, among others, of the Christian Democrats. So I don't see it as being a separate story at all. I think the exile story had a very different dynamic to it. I don't want to say that there was anything nefarious or opportunistic about it, because also it was a different generation of people who often didn't grow up under the same circumstances, or in some sense went through concentration camps themselves. So there's a different experience, right? I think Szczeciński and the generation younger, the two generations below him, had a real sort of reason for thinking of Christian democracy as a platform for a more inclusive vision of progress, which would have been a hard sell. I mean, Sieniewicz was only 5 years older. Popiel was born in the 1880s, and that's already a completely different story, right? Now, Szczeciński, as I mentioned, was born in the 19-teens, but really he didn't finish was almost done with his university education when the war broke out. He was rejected from the Air Force because of his eyesight. So he ended up working a kind of a entry-level job in the foreign ministry in exile in London. And this was his starting point for getting involved with Christian democracy. But I honestly think that he wouldn't have joined Stronnictwo Pracy if not for the fact that he was able to get to the US ultimately. His wife was already there. He wanted to be reunited with his wife. He had this skill set that he had developed in the late 1940s, traveling around Latin America, that he was ready to deploy. And he was sympathetic also because he grew up in a family that identified with Christian democracy. So, like I said, he's not a political philosopher, but he understood the key concepts and he was willing to build around them and negotiate around them. But he actually was a graduate ultimately of the Emigre Law. There was this very short-lived program set up through Oxford for Polish exiles. So he actually nominally received an Oxford degree, but it was a Polish language program with lectures from mostly Uniwersytet Warszawski, although not exclusively, during the 1940s. I don't know if you wanted to hear more about his later life too, but that's the path up to the story I told during the talk.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We have one more question.
When I think about social democracy, Christian democracy, sorry, I think that it's something like mixture of a right-wing ideology because it entails the Christianity and goes along the lines of religious aspect of society, and it also entails the left-wing, conception because of this socialist and all of this, progressive elements.
Yes.
And it's very much, I would say, European thing. From Europe it started.
Good.
But I'm wondering, it's needed because I think it's also this kind of centrist party that can attract the average voters, median voters, and then filter the radical groups. And I think the problem with Hungary or Poland or Latin America right now about polarization and populism is because the real social Christian democracy did not exist. It's somehow transformed, and we don't know why it happened. Maybe you know, and you will tell us. But another story is also about how social Christian democracy can travel in other geographic areas, like post-Soviet states, for instance, the country from where I come from, Georgia. I can't see any political party that resembles the Christian democracy because a historic memory, political memory. We don't like anything that is associated with Marxist, communist, and Right now, it starts somehow, we see the leftist movements, progressive movements, but they are not still so strong to attract the voters. And on the other hand, the factor of Christianism, because of the nationalist movements that were linked to the conflicts also, we always abstain to put on the far front the religious, although religious plays a role in Georgian politics and elsewhere also. So how you imagine, does Christian democracy has chances to travel beyond Europe?
Yeah.
So that's my question.
This is a marvelous question, and let me just say start with a word about Germany. Perhaps it's because of the dynamics of German unification. Not perhaps, it's definitely in part because of the dynamics of German unification. It's also a matter of shrewd intergenerational crossover and the ability to pivot and adapt. Christian democracy has shown itself to be very poor at surviving generational change. Just the example I gave to your question about the interwar versus the post-war, I think that there were authentic differences, and authentically, these actors saw themselves as being tasked with a different set of circumstances. Were they aware of the anti-Semitism of their political not-so-forefathers? They had to be. But it was just something that they pushed completely to the side and forged their own agenda. In Germany, there's a wonderful new book by a historian at Georgetown, Anna von der Goltz, who makes the case that Christian Democrats had their own 1968 in Germany. That's a pretty gutsy case to make when we think about what the West German left meant in 1968. And she does a really good job showing that it was possible to reinvent and yet maintain an overall image, coherent image. Now, what you pointed to the problem of religious identification. There are certain moments where churches become a real liability. And at the turn of the 1960s and 1970s, most of Western Europe, individual organizations, and this is true of trade unions, peace movements, and political parties, although not universally, right? The West Germany and Italy are the very important exceptions here, the ones that actually were most successful. Jettison the word Christian from their names. France never had the word Christian in the name of a political party, the MRP, but it did in terms of the Christian trade unions. The international Christian trade union movement renamed itself, rebranded itself in the 1960s. The Belgian scholars would say it deconfessionalized. I actually like that word a lot, because I think deconfessionalization is a few steps away from disintegration, frankly. The catch-all, if we look at the European Union today, nominally, the European People's Party, the successor associating party to the Christian Democratic International, it's incoherent. Orban tried very hard to be part of it. He was part of it, he was part of it. Orban was sitting alongside Donald Tusk, right? They don't, hopefully, probably soon, again, Polish Prime Minister, we'll see. But they have so little in common, except for the fact that they were both young, opposition leaders in 1989 against communist parties. And yet, what does it mean for them to be part of a Christian Democratic International together, which doesn't even call itself that anymore? People's Party. Popolarismo, right? That's the Italian legacy, which also very helpfully doesn't use the word Catholic or Christian. And in some sense, that seed was there from the beginning, because the single Christian Democratic Party before World War II that was least susceptible to anti-Semitism was the Italian one. And it was also the one that was destroyed by Mussolini with the thumbs up from Pope Pius XI. So Don Sturzo did well in exile and gets nice write-ups in a lot of the historiography, but he was crushed by not just his contemporaries, but the church, frankly. structurally. So the closer, between the religious institutions and the generational change, it becomes extremely difficult to sort of survive. I mean, you were asking about exporting from Europe. I think the reason why on some, so the Chilean Christian Democratic Party nominally still exists, sort of. We can discuss what it actually still means today, but why did it survive? Because like the Christian Democrats in Germany, after the Pinochet dictatorship, it did the concertación. It started partnering with socialists. It started partnering with social democrats and leaning into what you had referenced in your previous question, the social justice reformist agenda, the progressive agenda, in fact, which proved to be the most long-lasting and the most successful. Didn't guarantee anything, but it was certainly better than a confessional identification. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this amazing lecture.